So welcome back, everyone. We'll just allow everyone a few more minutes to come in. So we've still got quite a few people just rejoining after the break. So we'll just give everyone a couple more minutes and then we'll start this second session. Okay, so I'd like to welcome you all to our second session of the conference this morning. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Liz Molyneux. I'm a veterinary surgeon. I'm very privileged to be a trustee and one of the founder members of the Wild Animal Welfare Committee. Our second session this morning, as you can see, is on the contextual nature of how we value wild animals. And I'm going to leave you to read the biographies yourself, just so that we've got as much time as possible for questions. But it gives me great pleasure to introduce our first speaker on this second session, who is Mike Radford. Mike's a reader in animal welfare law at the University of Aberdeen, and as well as being known much more widely, he's particularly well known here in Scotland. And he's going to speak to us this morning on wild animal welfare, familiar concept, misnomer, or radical departure. Thank you, Mike.
Good day to you all, wherever you are, and many thanks to the organisers of this important conference for inviting me to contribute. That said, I'm now rather going to put a spanner in the works, or maybe in this context the better analogy is set the cat amongst the pigeons, because I'm going to ask, what are we all doing here? What are we actually talking about? What do we mean by wild animal welfare? Of course, animal welfare is a scientific concept, and in that sense applies as much to wildlife as it does to domesticated and kept animals. Whichever category they fall into, each animal will have a welfare which will vary during the course of its life. It may be good, it may be bad, it may be indifferent. And scientists can observe and measure and assess that animal's welfare, and they can provide insight into the factors which, for better or worse, have an impact on its welfare. So, in this scientific context, the phrase is entirely appropriate for wildlife. But the phrase animal welfare is not just a scientific concept. It also refers to a much wider societal meaning. And the definition which is given in the Oxford Dictionary of English is the proper treatment of animals. And it seems to me that that is significant for two reasons. First of all, the word treatment indicates that there is some connection between humans and the animals involved. It is the treatment which the human is providing. And secondly, the word proper indicates that there is an ethical, a moral dimension to animal welfare in this wider meaning. And this definition is much less appropriate, or at first sight seems much less appropriate in the context of wild animals, because the proper treatment of domesticated and kept animals is that they should be kept, treated to a high standard, and so far as possible that their welfare should be retained at a high standard. This is simply not possible with wild animals. What I've called the Darwinian dilemma is, and this is a quotation from On the Origin of Species, we all know that most wild animals will be killed before they reach maturity, before they're able to breed. And even those that do breed will eventually probably have a pretty dire end. All animals eventually end up as food for other animals. And it is absolutely essential that large numbers of offspring are produced, in part so that there are sufficient numbers to survive to breed, but in purely utilitarian terms, the majority who die young enable those who consume them to live a little bit longer. Of course, we do protect wildlife, we do have regard to it, and we have laws which seek to protect it. But overwhelmingly, those laws are retrospective in the sense that those who disobey them are only held to account after the event. So they're retrospective. And secondly, they are negative in character. They tell us what we must not do, but they impose no positive duties to do anything in particular. Now, of course, welfare in terms of domesticated and kept animals is very different. It is prospective in nature. It requires those who are responsible for animals to intervene to ensure that their welfare is protected. It is positive in character. It imposes obligations and duties on those responsible for animals to meet those animals' needs. It is concerned with individuals. It is not sufficient that the majority of your animals have a reasonable welfare. Each one is entitled, morally and legally, to have their welfare taken into account. And welfare focuses on quality of life, not only providing a minimum quality, but attempting to ratchet that quality up so that it is a good quality of life. And this approach is entirely appropriate for domesticated and other kept animals. They are under the control of humans who have voluntarily assumed responsibility for them. The state of their welfare is largely consequential on human intervention, and the approach has a clear ethical basis. No one has to be responsible for animals, but if you assume that responsibility, you will be held accountable for it, not just morally, but also legally. Of course, the situation is completely different with wildlife. No one really owns it outright, or certainly not the generality of wildlife. No one usually has assumed positive responsibility for it. And to intervene on behalf of specific animals may well compromise the welfare of others. If, seeing the buzzard wheeling over the rabbit in the field, I scare the rabbit off, I may have acted positively in respect of the rabbit, but I have acted to the detriment of the buzzard. And then we come back to the Darwinian dilemma that the natural world requires large numbers of animals to be killed early in their lives. To highlight two other differences between wildlife and animals under human control. Huge resources and specialist treatment is expended on injured wildlife. And whilst the animal is being cared for, it is self-evidently the case that those who have assumed responsibility for it have a moral duty in respect of its welfare, and certainly in the United Kingdom, a legal duty as well. And that extends to releasing them back into the wild, in the sense that it is incumbent on those releasing such animals to ensure that they're in a state where they can reasonably be assumed to have a fighting chance of surviving, and in an environment likewise. But once the animal is released, it's free living, there is no longer any moral responsibility, there is no longer any legal duty. It either prospers or not, as the case may be. Another example here is the sea eagle and the lamb. In terms of its rarity, the sea eagle is much more valuable than the lamb. That said, the lamb belongs to somebody, and if it is taken and killed, they suffer an economic loss. But also, they are responsible, again morally and legally, for the welfare of that animal, notwithstanding that it may be living out on the hill and to all intents and purposes similar in a similar situation to other wildlife. So what do we mean when we talk about wildlife welfare? Do we mean the well-being of individual animals? Do we mean supporting the population of certain threatened species? Do we mean having regard to particular species because of their capacities, their vertebrates, for example, or sentience? Do we mean conserving what there is? Do we mean encouraging greater diversity of wildlife? Do we mean wildlife management? Do we mean protecting ecosystems? Or do we mean leaving it alone and it either thrives or not as circumstances dictate? And of course, generally, they will dictate that that individuals don't thrive. And is wildlife welfare an appropriate term for these different objectives, either collectively or individually? Yes, the term wildlife welfare does imply a concept of collective social responsibility, and that implies the development of public policy in this area, and possibly with laws and legislation to back it up. But it still poses the question, responsibility for what? And with what objective? And by what means will it be achieved? And again, is this really to be regarded as welfare? So the question is, when we use the term animal welfare, is this the extension of a familiar concept? Do we simply mean the assessment of an animal's state? Is it a complete misnomer and we need another term to accurately express what we mean? Or is it a radical departure where we are suggesting that there is some sort of at least moral responsibility to have regard to the welfare of all living creatures, not just collectively, but individually? And if there is, how can that be equated with the Darwinian dilemma? It seems to me that this is where the argument for animal rights, whatever its strengths or weaknesses, hits the rocks. If an animal has an inalienable bundle of rights, including the right to life, how can that be equated with the reality of the natural world? And if rights mean anything, they cannot be compromised by the circumstances in which an animal finds itself. We don't look at humans living in an oppressive state and say, well, they don't have any rights. Those rights may be difficult, if not impossible, to enforce, but we don't deny them those rights. And surely, if they have them, the same would apply to other species. But it is difficult to see in the natural world how the notion of rights has any meaning or tool. So we need to decide what it is we're talking about and then find an appropriate term which accurately reflects and expresses it.
Hi everyone. I apologise for that ending. I'm not sure if Steve's going to get the end of it back again, or whether Mike would like to join me for some discussion.
Yes, I'm here.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Mike. I'm not sure what happened at the end. I don't know if you want to summarise your ending for us.
No, I mean, the simple issue is this, that as has already been indicated in previous presentations, the term welfare is perfectly appropriate in a scientific context in relation to wildlife. The issue, it seems to me, is if we are extending it into public policy, what does it mean, and what are we expecting that public policy to be?
Yeah, that's great. Excellent. I don't know if you can see the questions. You've got a couple of questions that have popped up. Thank you for your talk. One is asking, you draw quite a sharp distinction between wild and kept animals as a basis for saying that wild animal welfare is a misnomer, and whether that's actually correct and would sort of stand up to scrutiny.
Well, I think public policy in many countries, including the UK, so far as kept, domesticated and captive wild animals is concerned, is based on a straightforward rationale that, first of all, these animals' welfare is largely dependent on human intervention, and humans, either individuals or a family or whatever, have assumed moral responsibility for the welfare of such animals, and that is backed up by law. Now, clearly, with wildlife, it is different in the sense that the vast majority of wildlife, no individual has assumed responsibility for. It's just out there doing its thing. And if we're talking about public policy intervening to promote or require welfare for wildlife, what exactly is it that we mean? Because that is important in knowing what the nature of the public policy should be.
Excellent, brilliant. Thank you very much. I think there's a lot of room for more discussion later on in our larger discussion centre and section. I know people are sort of posting questions to us around that. So we look forward to seeing you again then. And for now, we'll say goodbye and introduce our next speaker. Thanks very much, Mike.
Thank you very much.
That's great. Thank you very much, Mike, again. And it gives me great pleasure to introduce our next speaker, who is Heather Bacon. So Heather's a vet specialising in animal welfare and working at the University of Edinburgh, although she's worked all over the world looking at animal welfare. Her talk today is on human behaviour towards wild animals. Why are they valued differently, and how does that affect their welfare? Thanks very much, Heather.
Hi everyone, I'd like to say thank you to the Wild Animal Welfare Committee for inviting me to speak today, and I'm going to be looking at human behaviour towards wild animals, why they value differently, and how does this affect their welfare. So in this presentation, I'm going to be introducing the theory of planned behaviour and the different factors that influence human behaviour towards wild animals and indeed towards animals in general. Asking whether we are entirely as rational and objective in our decision making as we perhaps think that we are, and what are the impacts of our decision making on the welfare and conservation of wild animals. So I'd like to start just by a brief explanation of the theory of planned behaviour. Some of you may be familiar with this. It's a fairly old model of behaviour, but I think provides quite a useful basic framework for thinking about how our behaviour may be influenced by a whole variety of different factors. In order to perform a behaviour, we first must recognise that there's something that we want to do. And then our intention to perform that behaviour will be influenced by our knowledge about the situation or the animal, by the societal, ethical value placed upon that animal, by our culture and peer pressure, and by our own feelings, personality, ethical perceptions and beliefs about that animal. Depending on all of these things, our intention to behave towards that animal in a certain way will be formed, and whether we actually follow through and behave in that way will also be influenced by our own habits and routines and psychological preparedness to behave in a certain way, and also by the physical resources, barriers and facilities that are available to us in order to facilitate that particular behaviour. So we'll be looking at the factors circled in this presentation. So looking in a bit more detail as to the different sort of ethical stances on the value of animals in society, and all of these things will influence our behaviour towards wild animals, as well as a number of other factors that we'll talk about. So we might consider that a wild animal has no moral status or no intrinsic value, and this would mean that we have no ethical duty towards them. And we often see this in animals that are pest species, for example, in the use of glue traps in rodents. And we also might see this in species that are perhaps considered pests in one context, such as wild kangaroos in Australia, but might be considered quite valuable in a different context, for example, captive kangaroos in a zoo in the UK. When we are considering animals to have no moral status, we also often change our language in the way that we talk about them. We use terms such as harvest to talk about killing them, and harvesting is commonly applied to non-sentient plant crops, but it is also used, for example, the kangaroo harvest, or we talk about harvesting fish from the sea, for example. A second moral position is that an animal has instrumental or extrinsic value, and again we change our language when we're talking about animals in this category. We value these animals only for what they provide for us, and this is reflected in the language that we use. For example, we might call them production animals. And then the third moral position is that the animal has an intrinsic value, and this confers a direct duty of care towards them because we care about their experience. And in this category we might include our companion animals, or any animal that we find particularly charismatic or have an emotional connection to. So whether we accord animals moral status or not can really be simplified as to whether we value them as a pet, that intrinsic value, for profit or for what they provide, instrumental value, or as a pest where we perhaps consider that they don't have value. And often our wild animals are interesting because they can sometimes shift between these different categories depending on their role. So if we consider the kangaroos that we've already mentioned, and it's the same with animals in zoos and the same with wild animals in different contexts, depending on a number of other factors. How we perceive wild animals does influence how we manage them. For example, the term LBJ, or little brown job, again that use of language is quite important, has been used for small brown species that are often perceived to be anonymous and difficult to recognise. And it's well recognised that generating any kind of conservation funding for LBJs is a big challenge, because people are much more likely to want to donate money to save the tiger or save the panda than they are to save an LBJ that they can't pick out from a different LBJ. Other factors that influence how we perceive and value wild animals are how they look, and this is perhaps something that we don't talk about so much because it makes us seem quite shallow, but certainly we are much less likely to be donating money towards the me-long giant catfish that you can see on your screen than we are towards animals that we find more aesthetically pleasing. We may also be biased against animals that we perceive to be dangerous or venomous, such as snakes or spiders.
And then how closely related animals are to us will also influence how we perceive them. For example, we would generally accept that having chimpanzees riding bicycles, such as we can see on the photo at the top, is unacceptable. However, parrots riding bicycles was societally acceptable until fairly recently, despite the fact that the welfare impacts on the individuals involved are broadly similar, including things like early maternal separation, disruption of normal social relationships, inappropriate husbandry and environments, and potentially exposure to potentially stressful situations. In addition to phylogenetic distance, a number of other factors can also influence how we value different species, including our familiarity with them, the culture in which we grow up, and whether we're male or female. And we see this infiltration of the value of different species in different ways across a range of different uses of wild animals. This graph shows a study of US animal care professionals from zoos and looked at their acceptance of population management euthanasia in a range of species. We can see that lower vertebrates and rodents, the pest species, population management euthanasia was deemed to be highly acceptable, but was totally unacceptable in elephants, marine mammals, primates, and had a low acceptability in carnivores. So whether this practice was acceptable or not did not vary depending on the welfare impacts of those species or on any objective assessment, but was very much directly related to the value placed upon those species, regardless of their conservation value, but just simply as taxa, and much more related to their sort of charismatic or emotional relationship with the humans. And we see this in wildlife conservation practices as well. For example, in Scotland, on the Isle of Canna, the reintroduction of 2 pairs of breeding sea eagles has resulted in the culling of tens of thousands of rats, and then subsequent to that, tens of thousands of rabbits, in order to perform that reintroduction process. And so that's weighing up the value of a few members of one species versus the value of tens of thousands of individuals of 2 other species that are perceived to be pests within that context.
And these biases do influence our conservation decisions and the welfare of free-roaming and wild animals, how they're valued and how they're used. And I'm just going to illustrate that a little with a case example from my own experience. On the left of your screen, you can see a giant panda, a beautiful charismatic bear species, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. On the right of your screen, you can see an Asiatic black bear, also known as a moon bear due to the beautiful golden crescent on the chest. Moon bears are also, I think, quite beautiful. They have those enormous Mickey Mouse ears and long glossy black fur with their golden markings. In addition, moon bears are probably a pretty good conservation indicator species. This is a map of Sichuan province in southwest China. You can see it outlined in grey. The green areas are conservation hotspots, biodiversity hotspots identified by Conservation International. Overlaid on those green areas, you can see in the black grids the existing range of the wild Asiatic black bear. In blue, you can see outlined current nature reserves, which don't really map across terribly well to those biodiversity hotspots. And then in red, you can see the existing range of the giant panda, which does overlap with the biodiversity hotspots, but obviously not to such a great extent as the bear habitat, because there's much less giant panda habitat, and it's in a slightly different type of ecosystem. So it's been suggested that actually, rather than spending so much money on preserving and maintaining those red areas, the giant panda nature reserves, and then also the blue areas, the existing nature reserves, which don't really map across to biodiversity hotspots, we would perhaps be achieving much more effective conservation goals if we were mapping our energies and resources and investment into preserving the Asiatic black bear, moon bear habitat, because this maps across almost exactly with those biodiversity hotspots highlighted by Conservation International. So the Asiatic black bear would be a great indicator species for conserving many other species as well in that region. However, to date, this hasn't happened, and that's perhaps because of the value placed on Asiatic black bears in Chinese society. So since the 1980s, about the same time that giant panda conservation was really taking off, Asiatic black bears have been used in commercial farms to produce bear bile. Now, bear bile has been used for over 3,000 years in traditional Asian medicine for its active component, ursodeoxycholic acid, which is a valid medicinal product against a range of diseases. We don't use bear bile in the West. We use commercially derived alternatives or herbal products and other pharmaceutically produced alternatives. Because of the commercialization of Asiatic black bears and the value now placed upon what they produce in terms of bear bile, it's likely that there are over 10,000 bears on farms in China, kept in conditions similar to what you can see on the right-hand side of the screen. This obviously creates enormous welfare problems for these animals, but also what it does is it devalues them as a species, and really means that they are never going to get the level of conservation resource or the level of attention that could safeguard some of those biodiversity hotspots that the giant panda does. So our biases can be a problem, because if they lead us to invest in species that look pretty but perhaps are actually of a lower conservation or biodiversity indicator value than other species which are instead used for a commercial output, then we could be inadvertently having negative impacts both on conservation and the ecosystem, but also creating situations that have significant welfare detriments to the species that we are trying to protect. The value placed on giant pandas probably actually hasn't helped improve their welfare in terms of their captive management, and the lack of value placed on Asiatic black bears as a conservation species certainly hasn't improved their welfare on bear bile farms. But it's important to recognise that that focus on instrumental value applies not just to Asiatic black bears, but also to many other species that we value for production, for research, and the language that we use around those animals really highlights how we value them. So by understanding the different factors that influence our intentions to behave in a certain way, how we value or don't value and categorize or don't categorize the animals that we are managing, this helps us to understand our own biases and how perhaps we might change our own behavior in order to improve wild animal welfare. So in summary, we will automatically categorize and label animals, but by being aware of this categorization, we can better consider the impact of our actions. Thank you very much for your time.
That was great. Thank you very much, Heather. I'd like to invite you to join me for some questions.
Hi,
There
Liz.
she is. Hi, thank you very much. That was absolutely brilliant. I'm not sure if we've got too many questions in the chat. I guess one really from me, it's really great in terms of being aware of our own biases, but a lot of these are on a much bigger scale and are cultural biases. And I know through a lot of your work, that's what you've worked against. Can you just give us some ideas about how we can influence those?
Well, that's a big question. I think it really does depend on the context and understanding the situation that you're in. I think one thing that I've certainly learned is that quite often we will have a perception of what we think the problem is or what we think is driving a particular animal welfare problem. But actually, if we really engage and talk to people on the ground who are living in that scenario or that situation, the things that we think are the problem are often not the problem. So a bear bile example would be, I have met and interacted with a number of bear bile farmers. In every case, those farmers care about their animals. And when those animals are seized, often due to illegal practices, those farmers are genuinely concerned about the future welfare of their bears and where their bears might be going to, even if they're going to in this case, a very reputable sanctuary, those farmers are still incredibly concerned. And from our perspective, I think it's often difficult to reconcile the realities of the welfare problems that we see with that level of emotional concern shown by the people who are inflicting those welfare problems. So I think it's really important to remember that everything is relative, and if that is a cultural norm within that geographic location, then it won't necessarily automatically be seen as a welfare problem, and it's often not being enacted through maliciousness or cruelty. It's often simply just a normal situation in that country, in the way we treat our production animals is quite normal.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you very much. You have got some other questions, but I'm going to save those until the longer session later. So I'll invite you back later on for that. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
So I'm now going to introduce our third speaker on this session, who will be well known to some of you. He's Alick Simmons. He's a veterinary surgeon and a naturalist and photographer, and an incredibly passionate member of the Wild Animal Welfare Committee. And he's going to talk to us today on why different welfare standards are applied to different animals in different settings, which is a theme other speakers have already touched on a little bit. Thanks very much, Alick.
Good morning. My name is Alick Simmons. I'm going to be talking this morning about why different welfare standards apply to different animals in different settings. I'm a member of the Wild Animal Welfare Committee, and I wanted to say how pleased I was to see at the turnout today. It's really encouraging to see how many people are interested in this. I hope you've enjoyed the programme so far, and I hope you enjoy the rest of it. I'm going to start talking about the differences in welfare standards from a perspective of 5 separate groupings, really, and to a degree it's worth remembering that these are probably overlapping to an extent because they're not hard and fast, mutually exclusive categories. But I'm going to talk a little bit about culture and why that influences policy. I'm going to say about what I describe as assumed values, which differentiates one species from another and has an impact on how they're protected. How inconsistent values have driven the types of ways in which we allow for animals to be killed, how values have changed over time, and a little bit about why I think some species that are out of sight really get little care at all. So starting off with culture, on the left-hand side is a humpback whale representing the species of great whales, and on the right-hand side is a brown rat. Now, these are obviously very, very different creatures, but they're both mammals and almost certainly have the same capacity or very similar capacity to suffer. Perhaps without evidence, we still need to give the benefit of the doubt to both species. And yet, we have a substantial difference between the way in which these are treated by government, which I believe reflects the culture which prevails in our society. UK government has now been has been for many years, saying that whaling is unacceptably cruel and economically unnecessary. So therefore, they're never going to allow for, or they're always going to argue against the resumption of commercial whaling. Whereas on the right-hand side, you've got the brown rat with a statement beneath it from a department of the Agriculture Department, same department, which says that anticoagulant rodenticides, that is, the widely used poisons for rodents, are markedly inhumane. So on the one hand, what we have is policy reflecting culture, which says we'll never kill whales because it's unacceptably cruel, and yet we have another species, or perhaps a group of species, which we have got one of the main, perhaps the most widely used way of killing rodents, these rodenticides, which are markedly inhumane, and no attempt to make any change to the way in which we do things. So there's a fundamental difference. Again, here we have our friend, the little brown rat, sitting in the vegetation. What I wanted to do was try and demonstrate this culture goes a bit wider still. We provide little or no protection for wild rats, but on the other hand, in two other circumstances, on the right-hand side, in a laboratory and as pet rats, these animals are admittedly given different standards, but they are fundamentally better protected, better cared for, and more carefully destroyed when the time comes than the wild rat is. So even though almost certainly these animals, these three animals, have got exactly the same capacity to suffer, somehow we treat them entirely differently. Differences between species sometimes can be attributed to the value to which society gives them. For example, the red deer, representing all 6 species of deer present in the UK, is protected by the Deer Acts, which provides both a closed season, it prescribes and proscribes certain methods of killing, even down to the velocity and caliber of the rifles that can be used, and prohibits certain things like lamping at night and so forth. And in addition to that, again, I think associated with the value that society applies to deer, the way in which deer killing and stalking is done is almost certainly widely through adopted training and certification, which is not mandatory, but which is widely used across the country. And yet that contrasts, I think, quite markedly with an animal which I would describe as having a low assumed value, which is the mole. Leaving aside the arguments about whether it's worth killing them or not, which I have to say the evidence is pretty thin, the mole enjoys almost no protection. There's little prescription over the methods that are used to kill them, whilst the types of killing methods have reduced over years since strychnine and other poisons have been withdrawn. The traps that are widely used now, which are freely available in garden centres and elsewhere, really are almost certainly inhumane. The work that my colleague Sandra Baker has done has demonstrated that these traps that really kill these animals quickly, and that the damage it's caused them means that almost certainly they suffer for a long time before they die. And then in addition to that, there's almost no training required, certainly no mandatory training, and there's no scrutiny at all of the way in which the work is done. So there we have an animal with considered to have a low value, and this is the way we treat it. This sort of spills over into what I think is inconsistency. We've got exemptions for certain types of traps from the standards which apply to most other traps. On the left-hand side, the unapproved mouse trap, which has been exempted from the legislation which requires the ability to kill these animals humanely. And on the right-hand side, examples of approved traps which have been through a process of demonstrating that these animals that are trapped by these traps are killed quickly and dispatched effectively. the work that's been done again by Sandra Baker with the spring traps on the left-hand side, some generally known as breakback traps, really demonstrate that because of the lack of approval and consistency in manufacturing, both within types and between types, shows that almost certainly a substantial number of these are inhumane, whereas on the right hand side, they tend to be more consistent, even though there are some doubts about that. I should have said, of course, that on the one on the right hand side, they may be approved for rats and mice, but of course, primarily they're used for stoats and weasels and rabbits. Values change as well, and I wanted to illustrate that by showing you photographs of two species of squirrel. On the right hand side, the red squirrel, admittedly looking rather grey because it's in winter pelage, and on the left hand side, a grey squirrel. These species are both present in quite large numbers, albeit in different parts of the country, but one is introduced, the grey squirrel, and the other one is native. What's interesting is that in general, I wouldn't say the red squirrel has been sanctified yet, but it's fairly close to it. A lot of effort is going into protecting these animals, and a lot of effort is going into getting, as far as practicable, the grey squirrel reduced in numbers and in range because of the threat it represents to the red squirrel, and also because it is considered to be a little bit of a pest. But what's interesting about that is it wasn't always that case. It's only really 80 to 100 years since red squirrels were being killed in vast numbers because of their perceived impact on forestry in Scotland in particular, and they were considered to be vermin at that stage. Admittedly, at the same time, there were people trying to reintroduce them, to the extent where most of the Scottish squirrels have got Scandinavian ancestry. So what we've got is changing values. They don't always stay static. And then, of course, the final point is animals that are out of sight or not obvious, they don't seem to get the same level of protection. Moles we've talked about, rodents we've talked about, and sea mammals I wanted to bring up because of the damage that's done to them from a variety of different things like bycatch, the impact of acoustic deterrents from various different undersea operations, legal seal killing to protect fisheries, strandings, and a number of other things. Now, admittedly, things have changed a great deal, but for many years there was never any interest in these animals at all. Again, I think probably because of lack of experience, these animals being out of sight, people weren't particularly interested. So I suppose, having said all of that, you'll have to ask yourselves, is this important? I've already mentioned sentience, consciousness. We have more and more evidence of these animals, irrespective of any sort of traditional approach, is that these animals with a nervous system, a physiology, and anatomy broadly similar across the whole vertebrate fauna is very likely to have the ability to suffer, and therefore we ought to be giving them the benefit of the doubt. But as we've already heard, protection is patchy and consistent. A number of animals are already exempt from various different types of protection, and also from any controls about how they're killed. And for those animals that are at least killed by various different methods, there's quite a lot of there's a lot of evidence lacking that these animals can be trapped, poisoned, or otherwise killed humanely. And we need to do some work to get that sorted. And then finally, given that a number of the animals that we've talked about don't have a closed season, the welfare of unweaned animals and dependent animals, youngsters, is of concern when social groups are disrupted through culling and other operations. So the question we have to ask ourselves is, where do we start? If we're going to get on top of this problem, how do we get more consistency about what we do? I believe the first one is that we need more experience and more education. We need to get people used to wildlife. I think the lack of experience in this country about wildlife, because of such a depleted fauna, has quite an impact on how we are going to interact with animals and what tolerance we have for them. So if we're going to have a better, greater coexistence of wildlife tied in with abundance and diversity, more experience, better education is essential. Second, there's a need to recognize sentience, consciousness, and the capacity to suffer in all vertebrates, given what we know about their anatomy, their physiology, and their essential, broadly similar nervous systems. And we can only do that by making sure that we take a consistent approach, which means giving the benefit of the doubt. Now, this is not a new concept. The argument about whether or not we recognize consciousness was first mooted by Jeremy Bentham, a philosopher in the 18th century, really arguing that it wasn't necessary that we understood whether animals can reason or talk, but whether they could suffer. And you can argue that that has been central to the way in which we've regulated and treated animals, at least domestically, in farms and research animals for many years now. And the arguments that that Bentham brought forward are sort of refined a little bit by Marion Stanton Dawkins in 2017, where she's arguing that it doesn't matter what we know about consciousness, because we have to make the assumption about animal health and what animals want, rather than going through the intellectual exercise to establish consciousness. Once we recognize that the capacity to suffer is widespread and generally in all species of vertebrate, then that does lead, I think, to the need for a detailed and comprehensive review of the humaneness of lethal intervention and other interventions in wildlife, and to address these gaps and anomalies, and to find ways to better manage the problems which this inconsistency leads to. And consistency, to my mind, is really important here. And there are all sorts of examples of that. Here we have two species of the 6 species of native mustelid. These two species enjoy pretty high levels of protection, albeit somewhat with a number of exemptions, particularly in the species of the badger on the left. But on the right, the pine marten, a recovering species after decades of persecution, is now recovering. So we've got these two species with a degree of protection, but within the same family, weasels and stoats, very little protection from the point of view of numbers, but also the way in which they're killed is probably not terribly effective. And one has to ask whether it's necessary in the first place. And finally, evidence. It's really important that we've got good evidence to support the way in which interventions are made. And I think this was neatly summed up in one of the papers that has driven the way in which we've approached, the Wild Animal Welfare Committee has approached these issues over the last few years. And essentially what it is wildlife control can only be justified when there's evidence that substantial harm is being done to people, property, livelihoods, ecosystems, and other animals. And if we move towards that sort of position, we'll start to address a great deal of these anomalies, simply because the evidence that will be there will support the way which we're going to approach these things. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you very much, Alick. I'd invite you to join me.
Here we are.
Brilliant. That was really good. Thank you very much indeed. We've got a couple of questions. The first one is, if you're going to choose between education, evidence and regulation, which do you think can make the most difference to changing the current situation?
Well, regulation it can be a useful tool, but the real worry I have there is that almost certainly getting the level of compliance that would be required by a new legislation would be very, very difficult to achieve because of the wide nature of the area that we'd be needing to look at. So I think really the important thing is to change people's attitudes or influence people's attitudes and take what we know about, for example, sentience and consciousness and ensure that people understand that and base that, the evidence that's there to influence people's attitudes, because I think that's the thing that changes. You take the example of seatbelts. Most people were wearing seatbelts before it became compulsory to wear them because they believed through education and probably their own experience or the experience of friends that it was the right thing to do. And I would like the same approach to be taken with this.
Excellent. And we've got quite a nice question as to what sort of rat would you like to be, Alick? Do you want to be a lab rat or a pet rat or an animal in the wild? From the point of view that if you're a pet rat or a lab rat, certain human contact's going to take place that you might not particularly like, but in the wild, obviously, you run the risk of being trapped or poisoned. So which is the better welfare?
Well, let's start with the pet rat. I think I would want to avoid that. I struggle with my own weight, and I think an awful lot of pet rats are grossly obese. So let's avoid that. I think what's extraordinary about the laboratory animal is the regulation that's there is absolutely extraordinary. I've experienced of it over several years, and the way in which that is done is extraordinarily complex. Arguably overbearing, or at least some people would say that. And yet, of course, like you say, with the wild rat, I think I'd like to take my chances out in the wild and can maintain high levels of neophobia so that I avoided all the poisons.
Excellent. Thank you very much. We'll invite you back to the panel for some more questions later on, but thanks very much for now, Alick. Brilliant. So last speaker on this session today is Becca Franks, and I'd firstly like to say thank you very much to her for getting up so early, a bit in the same way we kept Nayo up quite late. We've woken Becca up quite early, and we're really grateful for her coming and joining us today. So Becca's a research scientist at the Department of Environmental Studies at New York University, and she focuses on the well-being of aquatic organisms. And you can read the title of her talk there, so you don't need me to read it for you. So thanks very much and welcome to Becca.
Hello, thank you very much for attending this talk, and thank you to the Wild Animal Welfare Conference for inviting me to speak to you about From Wildlife to Farmed to Invasive and Back Again, Animal Welfare Problems and Solutions Revealed in Our Inconsistent Treatment of Fishes. Before I get started, I want to thank institutional and foundational support from a variety of places, as well as a network of collaborators and fantastic colleagues without whom this work would not be possible. To begin, I want to talk about a particular species, the silver carp, and their story in terms of their relationship to human beings. But first, let's just start with the silver carp. They live across Southeast Asia, and they migrate annually between lakes and rivers for spawning. They're filter feeders, which means that they eat plankton, cyanobacteria, and algae. And they live for perhaps 20 years, maybe more, maybe less. We don't know, because it turns out that it's very hard to track them and it's hard to date how old they are when you have a live specimen who you've just encountered. And as you can see here, they are formidable jumpers. They're known for being particularly hard to catch in nets because they just jump right out of the nets. And if they get disturbed from boat traffic, are liable to jump out of the water and potentially into the boat, sometimes hitting humans and damaging boats. Of course, however, the silver carp have much more to fear from us than we do from them. They're classified as near threatened in the wild. They're a wild species, but they're one of the most popular animals in aquaculture, with approximately about 10 billion individuals being raised and slaughtered each year. They've been introduced around the world primarily for control of other wild species, in particular their ability to eat algae and cyanobacteria. And then that has led them to do well enough that they become classified as invasive species in multiple countries around the world. They're used extensively in scientific research as well, with over 1,000 papers looking at them as model organisms for their, exposure to toxicity and measuring toxicity in rivers and lakes. In aquaculture, of course, the ability to raise them in hatcheries and release them, and then, of course, for environmental management, again, for control of other species and environments that have gotten out of our own control. As far as I know, they're not used or kept in private homes, but I'm not sure about that for sure either way. But the overall picture is one of intensive use. And as of Thursday, April 15th at 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, there was not a single publication about their welfare, despite this incredible use by humans. So this story about silver carp is typical of wild fishes in general. Wild fishes are facing mass extinction. They're also being used in agriculture at a massive scale, with probably over 100 billion individuals being farmed each year. And these are, for the most part, entirely wild species. They're introduced around the world for various purposes, including for, quote, sport. And after they do well, they're then reclassified as invasive species. Scientific research on fishes is growing exponentially. And they're the most popular animals in the wildlife trade, both the illegal and legal. And yet, we have very limited knowledge about and legal protections for their welfare. I want to sort of focus in on these two particular areas of use, though, scientific research and in home aquaria. So if we consider the various forms and shapes and colors that fishes can take, and the incredible range and diversity of who they are, I think it's safe to say that fishes are actually quite attractive. And given the numbers in terms of their wildlife trade, they should be classified as a charismatic species, even though they rarely are. Surely what's driving this trade has something to do with our attraction to the way fish look, at least. On the other side, we have their popularity in science, which is being driven by the growing realization that they're more like us than we previously thought. And that's not just about their biology, but also about how they are mentally. So there's ongoing research showing that they have personalities, they have elaborate social structures. Those social relationships are important to them, and if they are deprived of the social relationships, they show signs of anxiety and depression. And if you remove elements in their life that they show signs of wanting or having a motivation for, they exhibit anxiety-like depression, anxiety-like behaviors, depression-like behaviors. Even some researchers have said psychosis behaviors. There are now studies that examine their addiction to alcohol and other drugs after having disruptive experiences. They're studied for post-traumatic stress disorder. The list goes on and on and on. And so we have this attraction to fish, and we have this recognition that they're very similar to us. And yet that has not led to greater protections and greater respect for them, but instead a greater use of them. So one could imagine that a question a fish might have would be who to blame. As usual, I think Aristotle is a likely candidate. In particular, in this case, because he's one of the first people who spoke about the scala naturae, or what is translated as the great chain of being, which is the idea that there is some vertical linear hierarchy in the way that nature is ordered, with God at the top, followed by human beings, and then primates, and then other mammals, all the way down to minerals. And if we're considering the vertebrates, fish are inevitably ranked at the bottom of the scale. And so they're just considered to be, in the scala naturae perspective, primitive to human beings and inferior, lesser than, further away from the ideal deity compared to human beings. Now we know that this perspective is antiquated, outdated, factually wrong on a number of fronts, and we've known this for a very, very long time, and yet it's a very persistent and sticky idea. So you see scala naturae even in modern scientific publications, where there is a sense of an inevitability of evolution, where you have modern species being put ranked in order in some sort of linear hierarchy. And I would just point out that Darwin, in developing the theory of natural selection and evolution, already was rejecting this idea and instead proposed a branching tree-like structure to understand the relationship between living species rather than this linear hierarchy. So this is something that we have known to be inaccurate for hundreds of years, and yet it still persists and is evident in modern science. So this scala naturae really exposes this core misconception that we have about the natural world. So, like I said, any creature who is alive today is not primitive to any human, and they're certainly not our ancestors. And this is akin to confusing your second cousin with your great-grandparent. So to see what that looks like, imagine your family tree. And all of the extant species are essentially of our generation. They're the current generation that's around today. But when we have a scala naturae where we're placing current living species below us in the progress of evolutionary time, we're getting this relationship completely sideways. So we have it flipped, and we're so focused on ourselves. And then we imagine that all of these other species who are living today somehow have evolved into us. Now, if you take this from the perspective of a second cousin, this is very odd. They're not your ancestor. They're not primitive to you. They're not inferior to you in some sort of evolutionary scale. And yet this is what we do when we place animals who are living today, extant species, living species, lower on this hierarchy than ourselves. And this is what we do to species like the silver carp, where we think of them as being primitive to us, when in fact they're just our cousins. So this kind of thinking can be called anthropocentrism, where we're so focused on ourselves. And it really reinforces and reflects ideas about human exceptionalism and human supremacy. And it's evident in the way that we think about animals and defining them by our use of them rather than by who they are, and the mechanization of animal life, and even the idea of this mechanization of animal life. It's hard to even speak about without saying dehumanizing. We still insert ourselves into the equation, but the mechanization is the process of taking away autonomy, taking away motivation, taking away the animacy that all living creatures have, and turning them into something like a machine. The best word we have for it is dehumanization. But even the word dehumanization itself is still focused on ourselves. And this also leads to and is reflected in the emphasis on our duty and to manage other species. And within that duty is the implication that we have the ability to manage other species, and the emphasis on doing that rather than moderating our own behavior. So I would like to propose that when we think about wild animal welfare, we have existing frameworks that have been practiced for decades now. And as we all know, those existing frameworks very much center around reducing harm and suffering in terms of having more humane killing methods, or more humane transportation methods, or more humane management practices. And I think that all of those existing practices have their space and have their need and validity. And what I would instead propose is that what is needed now is also to add to the repertoire and think about the possibility, in light of the misconceptions that we have through anthropocentrism, to think about what would be new frameworks that are made available to us if we weren't being completely anthropocentric, and add those new frameworks to our repertoire of responses to the problems that wild animals face. And in so doing, in these new frameworks, one thing that we could consider is that we could reduce harm and prevent suffering by refraining from practices that cause harm and cause suffering, and instead focus on things that we can do to promote thriving and change our own behavior rather than the behavior and lives of other species on this planet. And so with that, I thank you for your attention, and I'm very eager to explore these ideas more in questions. Thank you for listening.
Interesting.
Hi, Becca, and thank you very much. Looking remarkably bright for this time in the morning at your end of things. Thank you very much indeed. That was a really great talk, and actually a lot of the themes you brought up around us valuing humans very differently, putting ourselves on a pedestal to other animals, are ones that have come up in some of the questions, and I think we'll actually probably save for the panel discussion a little bit, because they're really key to a lot of what we're doing. You've got a specific question about fish, and it's about invasive fish species. What should we do with invasive fish species? Do we remove them? Do we kill them? And how do we safeguard their welfare, but also do the same for the native species? And I guess that's a conservation question generally. You know, if we're trying to balance conservation and welfare, how do we do that? Which is a nice broad question for you.
Well, thank you for the question. So I think that, you know, with invasive species, of course, one of the problems is our framing of whether an animal is considered to be invasive or not. And so typically the terminology invasive species comes around because we deem that their activities in some area are not to our liking. And other species can be equally non-native and doing equally well, and we don't call them invasive for XYZ reasons. So this is true in North America in terms of the fish that we've introduced. Some of them we like because we have cultural practices around sport fishing, and we like sport fishing these certain species. And then you have a species like the silver carp, which Americans don't like eating and don't like fishing. And so there's this issue around these species are called invasive, and then other species who are also not native to North America are not called invasive. So I think even just the framing is problematic to call animals invasive. And it gets back to this idea of sort of thinking through our own particular human lens. And the other issue, of course, with invasive species is that we can try really, really hard to get rid of them, but most programs of extermination don't work. And so I think in complement to, trying to come up with more humane methods of control, we should also think about alternative methods of perhaps encouraging and the promotion of species that we like in the area. Like if we think that they're outcompeting some species, what can we do to change the habitat to foster more flourishing within the species that we're trying to promote, rather than this negative focus on killing the species that we don't like.
That's great, brilliant, thank you very much. I think that's probably something that applies across a lot of other species as well. So we've just hit 12 o'clock. We're going to have half an hour for some really good discussion, hopefully. So what I'd like to do is invite the other speakers from this morning and also Pete back in, and then we'll try and go through some of the questions that have been posed and have some discussion around that. That's great. I'm trying to work out how to. Brilliant. I think we've got everyone there. So I guess I'm going to start off by staying on this theme of sort of humans versus animals, because there's been quite a few comments and questions in the question box through all the talks about human values versus animal values, and whether or not those values should be equal, and whether there's too much elitism, I guess, for humans. And I'm going to put that in the context of, I think all of us are going to say yes, aren't we, on this panel? But considering that, where we are and we're all animal welfareists, how do we change the values of sort of popular cultures and populations generally with this? Because it's quite a hard thing for even us to get our heads around. So how are we going to try and make a difference and change society's views on this? Who'd like to wave your hand if you want to come in first?
I get okay.
Go on, Becca, go.
Well, I think that first of all, just having events like this and starting the conversation and opening up the space to start working through these issues in a way that maybe we haven't before is a great and obvious but difficult thing to mount, but incredibly central and important. And then I think one of the things that I see in particular with fishes, because there's so much talk about whether or not they're sentient and whether or not they can suffer and feel pain, I think we get this real lens on them as just like either they're suffering beings or they're like zombies, and those are the options and those are the range. And I think that moves some people, but what's missing from the picture is also understanding how they can thrive and flourish, and the rich complexities of their lives. And sort of this one quote that I came across recently is that, if you want to stay the hand, our hand in terms of the harm that we're doing to the natural world, one thing is the fear to stop us from doing the harms, but the other thing is it's motivated through love of the natural world. So I think that in addition to being concerned about reduction of suffering and harm, I think also celebration of the rich diversity of creatures on this planet, and having that be something that can be added value. The more you tune yourself in to non-human species in the world, it enriches our own lives, and so that can be also a place to inspire positive care as well as fear of causing harm.
Brilliant. Mark, do you want to come in on that?
Hello, can you hear me?
We can indeed.
Yes, great. Yeah, I'm just following on from as Becca was saying. I think we have an opportunity, if you like, that have come out of the various crises that we've been living through lately as well. We've got to bear in mind that, you know, we're talking a lot now about the biodiversity crisis and equating and looking at the connection between the biodiversity crisis, which is perhaps something that the wider public and policymakers are only more recently becoming more aware of, and the climate crisis, which is a little bit more sort of well embedded in the public consciousness and the minds of policymakers. And we have the two very big meetings, the Convention on Biological Diversity and the big climate crisis meeting coming up towards the end of this year, when those two issues will be considered, and you know, really important to emphasize the connection between them. And they provide mechanisms for trying to emphasize the importance of not just conserving biodiversity, but how important the issue of wild animal welfare and considering the welfare and the importance and the value of individual animals is to the successful protection and conservation and enhancement of biodiversity. So we can feed in through that process. And the absolute international disaster that's been COVID-19 has also provided an opportunity to say, whilst the exact origins of COVID-19 haven't been firmly established, it's highly likely that COVID-19 has transferred from wildlife, perhaps through intermediary species, to people. And it reflects on how we interact with wild animals and how we treat the natural world and how we treat the individual animals that make that are such a hugely important part of it. So in terms of how we make people more aware, I think we have to use these opportunities. These are really big opportunities to make some progress in terms of raising awareness of the importance of the way we treat individual animals, and you know, promoting concepts like the One Welfare Framework.
Heather.
Just a few thoughts really, and kind of reflecting on some of the questions that have been asked. I think one of the things that's quite important is to remember the similarities between different groups. In particular, I think between animal welfareists and conservationists in terms of the value that they place on animals, because quite often I think that we do focus on those differences, but there's increasing research that shows that actually in terms of how we value, in terms of giving animals an intrinsic value, that's broadly similar across both animal welfareists and conservationists, certainly within the sort of Western world. And so whilst we might, you know, put more focus on our different methodologies or approaches to how we manage wildlife species, I think that at the core of you know, although our management principles might be different, at the core of that there is often an inherent similarity in how we value wild animals. And the other thing I think that we often overlook in terms of sort of changing hearts and minds is, and it's probably a little bit reductionist, but you know, we focus quite often on sort of strategies to educate or generate empathy or all of those kinds of things. But actually, one of the things that's been shown to be really important is our childhood connection with the natural world and spending time in nature. And that's been shown across different cultures and countries across Asia and the developed world, the Western world as well, is that, you know, if you spend time in nature in childhood, you sort of seem to inherently understand the interconnectivity of ecosystems and become more tolerant of things like non-native species, pest species, vermin species. All of those kinds of animals inherently seem to become more valuable just from that process of spending time around them. So much more so than pet ownership or some of the other factors that we do often talk about.
Excellent, thank you. Pete, do you want to pose another question?
Well, I can, yes, and that following on from Heather, I think the concept of compassionate conservation, while it's not a title that affords universal acclaim, is a helpful one in terms of the way conservation and welfare are seen to lead in the same direction, where historically that might not have been the case. But I wanted to pick up on a point that actually was raised when Mark was talking earlier, and we didn't have time to pick up then. But it'll be interesting to get everyone's thoughts on how far our reach should be in supporting wild animals where there are welfare compromises, and should that be limited to where there's an obvious or direct human impact, or should we go further than that? Do we have a responsibility or a need to intervene when, for example, natural wildlife catastrophes happen and there's an opportunity to step in, or even, as has been raised, interspecies issues? Should we take the welfare stance there to do anything to protect one species or another? But as I say, that's a point that's sort of been raised by a few questioners today, and I'd be interested to have panelists' views on that.
Can I start on that one?
Yeah.
Okay. I think there's some pretty good arguments for intervening when there is no direct human interest at the immediate time of making that decision. And the example, I noticed that then Snedden's brought this up about invasive species. I'm uncomfortable about the use of rodenticides for killing rats on offshore islands to protect nesting seabirds. But I think I take a utilitarian view about this, that ultimately, if you do nothing about it, not only will you potentially lose rare or confined limited area species of seabirds, but also you will cause these animals untold harm for a long period of time. But the big advantage about doing that with a non-native species on a relatively small area is that it's got a beginning, a middle, and an end. You have an exit strategy built into the process. Far too often, interventions, whether it's against native animals or invasive animals, doesn't seem to have an exit strategy. It's merely part of the normal annual cycle of intervention. And that, I think, is something that both conservationists and also other land managers need to take into account when they make these decisions about when is it you're going to stop, when you're going to review, when you're going to find a better way of dealing with this. So I take the view that there are differentials between the objective, but also the geography as well.
Anyone else? Sarah?
Sorry.
Sorry.
No, Mark, you go first. I think you'll probably have a more holistic answer.
You'd be surprised. I also think it's important to kind of recognise that, you know, it's very easy to sort of categorise things during a talk and say, well, you know, it's okay to intervene when there's a direct human cause of an animal welfare harm, but we shouldn't intervene when there isn't. But the divide, if you like, between those two things is becoming increasingly blurred. And I mentioned in my talk, you know, that as human beings, we can identify all kinds of direct welfare impacts or welfare harms that we might cause to wild animals. But an awful lot of the welfare harms that are being caused by people are indirect, not necessarily because we're, you know, intervening with that particular animal at that particular time, but because we're changing wildlife habitats, or we're changing the climate, or whatever, which is then having an indirect welfare impact, and often, you know, conservation impact as well, on individual animals, populations, and species. So those boundaries, if you like, are becoming increasingly blurred.
Sarah?
Yeah, so I was going to give a specific example of aquaculture, which we talked about briefly this morning, and how the fish farm sector talks about protecting the salmon, often in Scotland at least, within its cages, and that happens at the detriment of other wild species, marine mammals, but not just marine mammals. Other species are shot, including seabirds, and most recently, where the law changed in Scotland and seals were not allowed to be shot anymore around fish farms, then the industry looks at other solutions without thinking widely enough, I think, about the consequences for other species. So in their efforts to keep seals away from the salmon, they will use these acoustic deterrent devices, which have knock-on impacts on other species and potentially the salmon too. But that's not been discussed a huge amount. So I'm slightly cynical about the motive of the industry there. But I have to say, I think in the UK we consider ourselves to be a very welfare-focused society, and I think if we can provide this information to the general public, then give them the information to make choices and decisions, then I mean human behavior is a complicated thing, but I think often we like to do the right thing. But of course, like all of these issues, industries have to step up too, and I think having conferences like this hopefully help to raise the profile of the issue at a level which enables governments and other stakeholders around the table to be thinking about welfare much more seriously.
Mike.
Thank you very much. I think Heather's absolutely right about education, but I don't have the same optimism about it as Sarah's suggesting. The problem with I mean, it's got to be done, but it's such a slow process, and so much of the time one is just speaking to the converted. I mean, it's another context, but there's plenty of education, plenty of information about don't buy puppies from puppy farms, and yet people still do it. And I think Mark is absolutely right about there being less and less of a distinction between welfare issues from humans and not. And ultimately, it seems to me it's political. Individuals can do so much, but on a minor scale. It's got to be dealt with and addressed politically.
Good. Excellent. So I'm going to follow that on with a question that's come up in the questions box. Is it actually possible to have legislation and policy that equally recognises the intrinsic value of all animals? Is that actually something we might ever achieve? Becca's smiling, so she must want to contribute to that.
I'm just going to blame Aristotle again, I guess, or at least the Greeks. The Greco-Roman legal system of distinguishing between persons and properties. And, there's some really interesting work coming out, again, sort of thinking about a more radical reconfiguration of our legal system, because I think most countries around the world have this person-property divide, and animals either are going to be property, or in the case of wild animals, they don't even have the property status. And so they just have it's very tricky to fit them into that formulation without any, they just don't fit in terms of protection for their own sake. And so some of the work that I've been following recently about changing, not just giving personhood to animals, but instead thinking about actually reconsidering this person-property divide and having different categories for like beingness. So Manisha Dekka, for example, has written a book recently called Anthropocentric Legal Orders, and she makes the case for just sort of getting rid of this Greco-Roman, like just completely throwing out the whole system. So it's super radical, but I think, we are in radical times, and so at least having these conversations might be worthwhile.
Alick.
Thank you. I think what you just said, Becca, is very, very interesting. I'll need to read a bit more about that sort of stuff. I was looking at it from a somewhat more prosaic view, and when I look at, for example, the legislation that governs the way in which we treat domestic animals, particularly farmed animals, that is so complex, layer upon layer of things that have evolved over decades, and then overlaid on that is European legislation, which well, presumably in the UK, we're going to have the opportunity to change if we so wish, but it's complex, and you've got all these weird anomalies that you can cut the tail off a sheep, but you can't cut the tail off a cow. You can cut the testicles off a lamb up to some date, but after a much later date, you can do it with cattle. So there's all sorts of weird things there already within what we've already considered to be a relatively well-governed bit of animal interaction with people. And yet I think there are an awful lot of messy bits in there. So I would really take the view that, like Becca has done, is that we need to be much more radical, understand what it is that we're trying to achieve, and the evidence base, or for that matter, a philosophical approach, which, like Bentham said, you accept that almost certainly, in the absence of any other evidence, these animals have the capacity to suffer. And if you do that, then it doesn't matter what you're doing with them, whether in a laboratory, out in the field, or in your home. You have got a duty of care towards them. But of course, that provides the next question that inevitably going to come back up is what Pete said, is at what point do you stop intervening or start intervening with wildlife? And I take the view that you need to have a proper wide-scale debate about that. I'm not in favor of pulling wild cats off rabbits or preventing sea eagles eating fawns and so forth, but I am in favor of actually having a proper understanding of what interventions we do, and making sure that those are done on an evidence base which is driven partly by people's values, but also by science.
Anyone else? Mike?
Alick, if you're talking about a duty of care, which is what we've got for domesticated animals, that raises the question of on whom is the duty placed, and what exactly does one mean by care? Because in a domestic situation, it's straightforward, relatively straightforward, because those animals are largely dependent on whoever's responsible for them, and that's largely determined on what their welfare is going to be. When you talk about wildlife, it's completely different. And I mean, I look out the window now and there's various things chasing one another around the garden and flying around. What exactly is the nature of my duty of care to them? I mean, you know, I don't want to be the pedantic. Well, yes, I do want to be the pedantic lawyer. But these words matter. These terms matter because they convey different meanings. What I think is really important across animal welfare generally, regardless of what sort of animals we're talking about, is that you, the scientists, engage with the politicians. Now, I know science and politics are completely different. You deal with objectivity and politicians don't necessarily, but it is really important that scientists come out of the lab and engage with politicians, because you have the first-hand knowledge to get this across to them.
Well, if I may, I'd quite like to respond to that. There's what I think is a real problem, because I think you mentioned that there's a lot of evidence behind, in general, for example, what drives the way in which animals are slaughtered for human consumption. Now, there's some real problems there. For the most part, it's driven by evidence. Yet, when you come to, for example, what might go on with the killing of wildlife, whether it happens to be a rat, a fox, or a stoat, essentially what you've got are centuries old or decades old practices which have never been assessed for whether they're humane or not. And in fact, actually, the biggest problem that many of the campaigners have got is being able to build an evidence base about things which blindingly obviously inhumane, like snares, for example. And yet somehow it's always on, the onus is always on the people that are arguing to have some change to come up with the evidence, where in fact my view about this, if you wanted to start finding a different way of killing cattle in slaughterhouse, first thing the government would say to you is come up with the evidence that this is going to work, this is going to be humane. And yet somehow when it comes to snares, we've got an entirely different philosophical approach we have to say, well, come up with a law, or come up with the evidence that these are inhumane. My view is, come up with the evidence they are humane, and we'll let you continue with it. If you can't come up with it, we'll stop. So there's almost like a convergence of the process by which you decide what is acceptable or not, which is driven by the evidence, but also, I think, society's values. I think it's worth remembering that many of the things that have happened with both dogs and cats and with farmed animals, what drove the science to be done in the first place, for example, about chickens in cages, was because people in general were getting upset about it. It wasn't because some scientists said, I think we've got a problem here. It was driven by people's values. So I think some of it's education, some of it, if you like, shining a light on these practices, but then driving it by public opinion, which forces the evidence to be either provided, or if it can't be provided, change comes about as a result of absence of evidence.
Heather.
Yeah, just to sort of actually following on quite nicely, hopefully, from what Alick is saying, I think that then this has been sort of mentioned in the questions as well. One of the elements that I think we often focus on is this scientific evidence. You know, we're all scientists, we've all spent a lot of time learning, acquiring knowledge and passing that knowledge on. But I think this also biases us to focus very much on knowledge transfer, or education, by which most of us mean knowledge transfer, as the sort of panacea to addressing most of these problems. And I think we often overlook perhaps a more transdisciplinary gap that we have in terms of understanding why people feel the way that they feel, or understanding why people behave in the way that they behave, and why they value animal contexts. And I think until we understand that better, we can't really, we don't change hearts and minds with knowledge. You know, people know stuff. People know that brachycephalic dogs have terrible welfare problems. They still buy them because they look cute. You know, you don't change practice with knowledge. You don't change emotional decision making with knowledge. And so I think there's a real opportunity here for more integration of social sciences, more understanding, and more kind of a holistic approach to finding out why people do what they do. What are the cultural pressures? What are the societal norms and values that they're holding, in order to more fundamentally engage with people and to change human behaviour? It's not just about knowledge transfer.
Gears. Any of the others want to come in on that? No. Pete, do you want to?
I was just going to say, Liz, I think, yeah, Glenn, particularly in the questions, I think he's cautioning animal welfare science not to be too insular, I guess, and as Heather has said, to be more, well, I would like to think we are, but I think to be more open in our engagement with other disciplines, working towards a sort of larger perspective, and I think that's quite right.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's when you talk about, is it wicked problems, you know, that we actually need input from everybody. Working on, say, something like tuberculosis, you know, the solutions are not all about veterinary medicine, and increasingly we've learned that it is about things like social science and understanding what makes people tick and what would make people change things. And some of the massive welfare changes, things like export of sheep from some countries, have been changed just through public pressure. So that is really very important. Anybody else on that?
Yes, and of course it's public pressure which pushes politicians into action.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
I would agree. I would absolutely agree. You know, we can't rely on the production of evidence and then the dissemination of evidence by, you know, through kind of formal or informal education. You know, we've got to tap into the sort of social science, the cultural aspects of this, the you know, public awareness and public opinion, regardless of whether or not it's driven by evidence. But once you start to make progress in that regard, there are some quite good frameworks that can be helpful. And you know, I know we're going to have a framework on the international consensus talk on the international consensus principles, which, as I tried to highlight earlier, start with the basis of, can we solve this problem by changing human behaviour? Is it actually a wildlife problem at all? You know, is the problem down to the wildlife, or is it down to the way the human behaviour that leads to the conflict or the issue? And in most cases, an awful lot can be achieved through human behaviour change. It's a matter of persuading people to look beyond what they consider to be normal or historic practice, and look beyond it, you know, with a view to improving the welfare or reducing the welfare harms that we're causing to animals. And there are other frameworks like the Sharp and Saunders model that's being used by Sandra Baker here in the UK to assess the relative humaneness of different pest control methodologies. So once you can get people to recognise that pest control causes welfare harms, then it shouldn't be that much of a leap to say, well, it's a good thing if you consider that control is necessary, to examine the various methodologies that would be available and pick the one that has the least welfare harms associated with it. So there are frameworks around that can be helpful, but you know, I do agree, you know, we've got to move beyond the idea that science and evidence is going to give us all the answers.
Thank you, Mark. That is a brilliant advert for this afternoon session. So whether you intended it or not, thank you very much indeed. Anyway, we're going to finish now, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you again to all the speakers. We've had a fascinating morning. I hope we've all learnt a lot and looked at new perspectives on wild animal welfare issues from around the world. So thank you to the speakers, particularly Becca, for getting up early. Thank you very much indeed. Thanks to Steve Wickens for masterminding things behind the scene. And as I mentioned at the end of the first morning session, we're going to close the session now. So if you want to listen this afternoon, and we hope that you will very much indeed, you'll need to log on again at 1300 hours UK time, using the same login details that Stephen provided you when you registered for the meeting. So thank you all very much again, and thank you to the audience. We've loved having you with us, and we look forward to seeing you again this afternoon. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Pete.